Shalom, Chavrim. James Trim here, and we are ready to begin Lesson 13 in the Through the Book of Enoch series. And with Lesson 13, we're ready to, we've completed the Book of Watchers, we've completed the Book of Similitudes, also known as the Book of Parables, and we're ready to begin what's known as the Astronomical Book or the Calendrical Book. I prefer Astronomical Book for reasons that will become apparent in this study. And today's study is really going to be an introductory study in this section, third section, the middle section actually of the Book of Enoch, because there's a lot of special information that is necessary to deal with the study of this particular section of the book. It's very different from the other sections. It deals primarily with astronomical phenomena, the movements of the motions and the movements of the luminaries. Some call it the Book of Luminaries. And there's some important information that you need to know about this particular section because so many take this ball and run with it without having done the proper research and having adequate information about the material. And once you have that adequate material, you'll understand why it is very dangerous to take this ball and run with it without an understanding of the nature of this ball and where it's coming from. So, hopefully you have your handouts, and our first handout, first page of our handouts is labeled Astronomical Book Warning Label. And in this section, at least in today's study, I'll be having some quotes from some modern writers and literature, particularly this book, the Enoch, A Man for All Generations by James C. Vanderkam. Here's the interesting thing. I'll be making use of it, but I don't recommend it. Excuse me. I'm allergic to mountain cedar, and I'm in Colorado, so that's a recipe for allergies. So James Vanderkam is an academic, and this is a liberal scholarship academic kind of a book. It certainly doesn't treat the Book of Enoch as an authentic work. So if you can read and study it with some discernment, then it can be valuable and helpful. But the book certainly doesn't treat the Book of Enoch as an authentic work of Enoch, or even as a single composition by a single author. So a quote from this book, that in the portion of this book that deals with the calendrical section, that is here at the top, page 20 of the book. The author penned it in the Aramaic language. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to take issue with that. For purposes of this study, we're maintaining that the author is Enoch and that he penned it in Hebrew. But with slight modification, we can modify our understanding of what's being said here, that very early there was an Aramaic translation. And Aramaic and Hebrew, for those that don't know, are cognate languages. They're very similar. I knew of a Aramaic professor once that used to say, Hebrew, give me 20 minutes and I'll teach you Aramaic, which was a bit of a joke. It's not quite that simple, but it's like Spanish and Portuguese, okay? So they're very similar languages. They use the same 22-letter alphabet. They use many of the same roots, so they have a lot of very similar vocabulary and much of the same grammar. Which means if you take something Hebrew and you translate it into Aramaic, it looks a lot like the Hebrew, and it has a lot in common with the Hebrew. If you translate it into Greek, you lose the Semitic grammar, sentence structure, vocabulary, etc. Much of that gets preserved when you're translating it to Aramaic. Now, we have several copies, at least 7 Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch that were found at Qumran in Aramaic. They're fragmentary, and particularly in dealing with the astronomical section, they're extremely fragmentary. We only have little bits and pieces that have survived. And that brings us back to our little quote here. So keep in mind, we're having to mentally modify anytime he refers to original Aramaic, that there's really original Hebrew behind the Aramaic, but they're closely related. The author penned it in the Aramaic language. This conclusion has been suggested at an early time in the modern study of First Enoch, and discovery of 4 Aramaic copies of the Astronomical Book in Qumran, Cave 4, make it a virtual certainty. Nothing resembling a complete text. A copy of Aramaic Astronomical Book was at some point translated into Greek. From this Greek version, only a few scraps have survived, or have been found, sorry. From Greek, it was rendered into Ethiopic. Only in various Ethiopic copies is the complete work preserved, but it is rather different from what is known of the Aramaic original. And of course, we know that there's actually a Hebrew original behind the ancient Aramaic version. So, at least that's the position we're taking in this study. All right, something gets lost here in translation, literally. And what I mean by that is that Ethiopic is a Semitic language with a lot in common with Hebrew and Aramaic. But unfortunately, the Aramaic got translated to Greek, so it lost all that Semitic grammar, all those Semitic roots, and then the Greek version got translated into Ethiopic, and so then we have this Ethiopic version, but it's not directly from the Aramaic or from the Hebrew, so it's lost a lot in translation. But even worse, we have the Greek fragments, a few fragments, scraps really of the Greek, not much. We have scraps, 4 fragments of the Aramaic. All of this is enough to compare and see from these fragments the direction of translation, and to see that the Aramaic grammar, the Semitic grammar of the Aramaic and the Semitic roots of the Aramaic got lost through this Greek filter. But like I said, it's worse than that, because when we look at the Aramaic version, the bits and pieces that we have of it, and we look at the Ethiopic version, the bits and pieces that we have, well, we have it complete. What we discover is that the Ethiopic version is quite different from the Aramaic original, or the Aramaic version, and therefore the Hebrew original. It's, quote, rather different. And in fact, when we look at the Qumran text, there's whole sections in the Qumran text that don't have any parallel at all in the Ethiopic. And there's large portions that aren't represented at all in the Aramaic, and we don't know if they existed in the Aramaic or Hebrew. So this is my own comment down here in the handout, while I maintain that the Book of Enoch was originally written in Hebrew and then translated to Aramaic, it's important to know that the work today survives only in Ethiopic, which appears to have been translated from the Greek version, which appears to have been translated from the Aramaic version. And the Ethiopic is rather different from the mostly lost Aramaic and Greek versions. In short, we don't have a reliable version of the astronomical section of the Book of Enoch. It is inadvisable to form new doctrines and calendars based on this text, which we know is rather different from the original Hebrew. We don't really know what the original said, and all we know is that it was rather different from the Ethiopic that we have. But since the Ethiopic is all that we really have, that's all we can study. And so that's what we'll study. But it must be taken with a grain of salt. And I will, as we study, make reference to the few Aramaic fragments that have survived. And so we can at least make use of them where they exist. But the important thing to know is, right off the bat, we don't really know what this book says. Just be honest in the astronomical section. We just know that the text we have is rather different from the original Hebrew. Okay. The next handout here is, in page in our handout, is the Astronomical Book, a calendar. Some people call it the calendrical section. Some people have taken that ball and run with it, including some people, probably an ancient people at Qumran, who have taken the astronomical section of the Book of Enoch and assumed that it expressed some kind of an alternate Jewish calendar, alternative to the traditional Hebrew calendar, a Jewish solar calendar that some believe and argue is an original Jewish calendar, and that the traditional Hebrew calendar that we have today is some kind of a corruption or replacement or a falsehood, basically. So this brings us to another quote from page 25 of the same book, Enoch, a Man for All Generations. Again, still talking about the astronomical book, and he says, it should be stressed that the writer, he says writer because he's not taking the position that Enoch wrote the book, it should be stressed that the writer does not evaluate solar and lunar calendars. He simply presents schematic accounts of both, using numbered months, he never names them, and correlates them. Moreover, he makes no attempt to bring them into a Jewish cultic context. That is, he does not tie the festival cycle to either calendar, nor does he connect the rotations of the priestly groups with them. The calendar accounts are straightforward, objective descriptions with nothing distinctively Jewish about them. Thus, we search in vain for any reference to the Sabbath in the astronomical book. So his point here is, in other words, there is nothing to indicate that this material was originally intended to present a Jewish calendar, or even a calendar. It may only have been an attempt to develop a system for tracking astronomical bodies. Tracking the solar year is important for maintaining the traditional Jewish calendar, because a leap month must be added on occasion to keep the seasons from drifting and planting times starting to become too early. Because the traditional Hebrew calendar is a lunar solar calendar. It's a lunar calendar that drops behind by a month about every 3 years or so, and then an additional month has to be added to make the calendar stay in alignment with the solar year. The Islamic calendar, for example, is a pure lunar calendar, and it does fall behind about 10 days or so every year, and that's why the month of Ramadan, which is a holy month in the Islamic calendar, can occur any time of year and starts to drift around the calendar. That really doesn't work if you're using that same calendar to plant and harvest. Now, in the deserts of Arabia, that might not have been quite as important as it is in Israel, where you have the former latter rains, in Egypt, where the flooding of the Nile happens annually, or in the Fertile Crescent, where also planting and harvesting times are very important. So if your planting time starts drifting behind by 10 days a month, 10 days every year, it's not very long before you're planting in the wrong season. And you're already not planting at the optimum times after the first year. So we're not going to go into the inner workings of the Hebrew calendar and how different methods are proposed that it did this, but that it added a leap month every so often. Now, what criteria were used to do that is a matter of debate. I think we can establish what the ancient criteria was, but that's beyond the scope of this study. What's important here is that it would be important to be able to track the solar year, and to be able to do so in order to have something to compare the lunar calendar to, and to add the additional lunar month as needed to keep those two calendars in alignment. And in fact, the argument can be made that that's exactly what the solar year information contained in the astronomical section was for. Excuse me. Simply for tracing the movements of the sun through the period of a year and knowing how long a solar year was and when to add the extra month to the traditional Hebrew calendar. All right, we turn to our next handout, which is rather long. It's actually a full-scale article that I wrote some years ago. And the next thing, before we hit that, actually, another comment I should make about the previous handout, an additional comment I should make, it'll come important later, is that the Enoch calendar, as a calendar, the solar calendar does not work. And in fact, there's other flaws in the calendar, but the most important one is, excuse me, that the Enoch solar calendar presents a 364-day solar year. Now, if you are older than, say, 10, you're probably aware that the solar year is 365.25 or 365 and a quarter days. That is, we have a solar calendar that works very effectively that we use today, that's 365 days, and once every 4 years an additional day is added, thus 365.25 days. Okay, so the calendar, if it's a calendar in the Book of Enoch, doesn't work, because if you fall behind a day and a quarter every year, then in a few years, not as quickly as with the traditional, well, let's say with the Islamic calendar or lunar calendar unadjusted, but nonetheless, you fall behind quite a bit over a period of time. Eventually, your seasons are all out of whack. Okay, so our next handout is titled Wandering Stars. They did not come forth at their appointed times. The next point we're going to make here is that the calendar, or at least the astronomical movement information that is preserved in the Book of Enoch, or found in the Book of Enoch, may not be intended as an account of how the luminaries move today, but rather may be, in context, an account of how they were intended to move and how they did move prior to the fall of the fallen angels in Genesis chapter 6 and 1 Enoch chapter 6. So our handout says there's long been controversy of the astronomical section or the calendrical section. What is this calendar? Why does it insist that it works when it loses more than a day every year? Excuse me. Why is it filled with contradictions? Why does it disagree widely with the traditional Hebrew calendar? Why does it seem to insist that its solar months coincide neatly with lunar cycles when they do not? How could the new moon be significant to this calendar? The answers to all these questions can be found elsewhere in the Book of Enoch itself. The Book of Enoch recounts the fall of a group of angels who fell from heaven and took human form in order to copulate with human women. 1 Enoch chapter 6, Genesis chapter 6, and we've covered it over and over in this in the prior lessons. Now, chapter 41 gives a prophecy Enoch received before this fall of angels. See 1 Enoch 39:1. At that time, Enoch says concerning the movements of the sun and the moon, reading from 1 Enoch chapter 41, verses 5 through 9. And I saw the chambers of the sun and moon, whence they proceed, and whither they come again, and their glorious return, and how one is superior to the other, and their stately orbit, and how they do not leave their orbit, and they add nothing to their orbit, and they take nothing from it, and they keep faith with each other in accordance with the oath by which they are bound together. And we recently discussed that oath, by the way. The first sun, first the sun goes forth and traverses his path according to the commandment of Yahweh Zavaot, and mighty is his name forever and ever. And after that I saw the hidden invisible path of the moon, and she accomplishes the course of her path in that place by day and by night, the one holding a position opposite to the other before Yahweh Zavaot. And they give thanks and praise and rest not, for unto them is their thanksgiving rest. For the sun changes oft for a blessing or a curse. Excuse me. And the course of the path of the moon is light to the righteous, and darkness to the sinners in the name of Yahweh, who made a separation between the light and the darkness, and divided the spirits of men, and strengthened the spirits of the righteous, in the name of his righteousness. For no angel hinders, and no power is able to hinder, for he appoints a judge for them, and all he judges them, all before him. Okay, so keep that in mind, and now let's read something from the astronomical calendrical section, chapter 80, verses 2 and 6. And in the days of the sinners, the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy, on their lands and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time. And then verse 6, and many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear in the seasons prescribed to them. So, after the fall of these fallen angels, Enoch receives another revelation concerning the stars. The ancients counted the sun and the moon and the 5 visible planets as stars. They were all, the Hebrew word is kakavim, which simply means heavenly bodies, and it has much more ambiguity than our word stars. So after the fall of these fallen angels, Enoch receives another revelation concerning the stars, and that's in 1 Enoch chapter 18, verses 14 through 16, which we've already studied. I'll reread it. The angels said, "This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. And the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandment of Yahweh in the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. And he was wroth with them, and bound them till the time when their guilt should be consummated, even for 10,000 years." This is what Jude refers to in the book of Jude when he talks about wandering stars for whom is reserved blackness of darkness forever. It's no coincidence that the Greeks called planets wandering stars, or that the ancients identified them with false gods. What Enoch is telling us is that after the fall of the angels, recounted in 1 Enoch chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 6, the heavenly luminaries changed their motions, having rebelled against Yahweh's commandments. Whereas before the fall, referring not to the fall of man, but to the fall of the angels. Whereas before the fall, the sun, moon, and stars, quote, did not leave their orbit, and they added nothing to their orbit, and they took nothing from it, and they kept faith with each other in accordance with the oath by which they were bound together. 1 Enoch 41:5. Yet after the fall, they no longer, quote, did come forth at their appointed times, close quote. The calendar section in 1 Enoch was originally recounting, at least that's what I'm putting forward in this paper, the pre-fall calendar, or at least the pre-fall movements of the luminaries. I suspect that this pre-fall calendar had a 360-day solar year with exactly 12 lunar months to the day. Now, before you think that might be an astronomical absurdity, think about this. The sun and moon from the Earth appear almost exactly the same size. This is very interesting, and it's also very important. It's very interesting because the sun and the moon, in reality, are vastly different sizes. But they're also vastly different distances from the Earth. And the ratio of size and distance are, are such that from the Earth they appear to be almost exactly the same size. And this is what makes possible both lunar and solar eclipses as we know them. A lot of advancements in science have been made because we've been able to observe these eclipses. They've been very helpful in many ways, and it's only possible because of this amazing coincidence, or was it by design, by an infinitely intelligent designer creator? So it's also entirely possible that in the beginning, before the fall of the angels, that the lunar year, which is 354 days, and the solar year, which is 365 and a quarter days, and by the way, the lunar year, I said 354 days, that's approximate, we're actually somewhere in between an average 360-day year with exactly 12 30-day months. In that ideal 360-day year with 12 months, there's reason for thinking that we'll get into as this teaching continues. It's also not an astronomical absurdity, as it's very common for astronomical bodies to have some orbital momentum and or be tidally locked together. Sometimes on a 1-to-1 ratio, but sometimes in a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio, which I think the planet Mercury has in its rotation relative to its orbit around the sun. Okay, let's turn to the next page. Further evidence for this theory may be found in the ancient Egyptian solar calendar. This calendar, the ancient Egyptian calendar, had exactly 360 days divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 additional days added at the end of the year that weren't part of any month. It's obviously similar to the Enoch calendar, which adds 4 days instead of 5, and evenly spreads them into each of the 4 seasons. And we'll get into that later. Why would the ancient Egyptian calendar reflect a revision of Enoch's calendar? And the reason, a very good possibility, is found in Flavius Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 2, Section 3. Josephus writes, "Now Adam, who was the first man, and made out of the earth, for our discourse must now be about him, after Abel was slain and Cain fled away on account of his murder, was solicitous for posterity, a vehement desire for children, he being 230 years old, after which time he lived another 700 and then died. He had indeed many other children, but Seth in particular. As for the rest, it would be tedious to name them. I will therefore only endeavor to give an account of those that proceeded from Seth. Now this Seth, when he was brought up and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man, and he was himself of excellent character. So did he leave children behind him who imitated his virtues. All of these proved to be of good disposition. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions and in happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them till they died. They also were the inventors of that particular sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order, and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and another time by the violence and quantity of water. They made 2 pillars, one of brick and the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both, And in case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain and exhibit those discoveries to mankind, and also inform them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. Now this remains in the land of Siriad to this day. Siriad is believed to refer to Egypt. It refers to the land of the followers of Sirius. The Egyptian calendar used the movements of the star Sirius to establish the beginning of the year for their solar calendar, since its movements coincided closely with the annual flooding of the Nile. The pillar of the Sethites, which some today call the pillar of Enoch, had astronomical information from before the flood inscribed on it. Some identify the Great Pyramid with this pillar. However, this is unlikely. Josephus mentions the pyramids elsewhere in Antiquities 2, Book 2, Chapter 9, Section 1, as having been built by Hebrew slaves, and he clearly calls them pyramids, not pillars. Also, the Great Pyramid has no inscriptions, but the pillar of the Sethites had astronomical information inscribed on it. However, it may well be that the pillar of the Sethites contained information that was used to build the Great Pyramid, thus explaining its astronomical alignments. This is further supported by the fact that the ancient Egyptian god Thoth was a perversion of Enoch, and the ancient religion, a perversion of Yahweh worship into pantheistic polytheism. Thoth, which was corresponded with the Egyptian god Hoth, corresponded with the Greek god Hermes and the Roman god Mercury, was known by the ancients as the scribe of the gods or messenger of the gods, and was associated with the planet we know today as Mercury. The Romans' god Mercury was a slight revision of the Greek god Hermes, while Enoch was known as, quote, Enoch the scribe and the scribe of righteousness in 1 Enoch 12:4, 15:1, and also in the book of Jubilees 4:17 and verse 20. The Talmud refers to the planet we call Mercury as, quote, the scribe of the sun in the Babylonian Talmud, page 156a. The book of Enoch says, chapter 41, verse 1, after this I saw the secrets of the heavens, and how the kingdom is divided, and how the actions of men are weighed in the balance. I don't actually, there are depictions in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that show the Egyptian god Anubis weighing souls in the balance, and Thoth, the scribe of the gods, making a record. The false god Thoth, or Hermes, was in fact the result of pagans turning the worship to the worship of Enoch. These false gods are pagan twistings of Enoch. Enoch worship resulted from a misunderstanding of who Metatron is. There are two very different traditions about who Metatron is. One tradition has it that Metatron is, quote, the lesser Yahweh, close quote, the Word, or Adam Kadmon. The other tradition has it that Metatron is just another name for Enoch. How did the two become confused? Well, when we covered 1 Enoch chapter 71, you may recall that we found that there was some confusion between Enoch and the Son of Man at the very end of the book. Confusion which we resolved, but which explains why people could confuse Enoch as being the Son of Man. In addition to that, the earlier extra-biblical Maseh Merkavah account is found in the book of Enoch chapter 14, where Enoch comes before the figure on the throne and comes to hear the holy word. The setting is that Enoch has been attempting to intercede for the fallen angels. Enoch passes through the worlds and comes before the throne, before the word. Enoch is then given a message of judgment to take back to the fallen angels. Now the word or Memra is Metatron, and this word Metatron, who gave Enoch a message to take back to the fallen angels. In much a later rabbinic document, the Midrash of Shemichazah and Azazel, we read, "Forthwith Metatron sent a messenger to Shemichazah and said to him, the Holy One is about to destroy his world and bring upon it its flood." So that parallels 1 Enoch chapter 13 through 15 exactly, only Enoch has simply become a messenger for Metatron. The name Enoch has become dropped. Shemichazah and Azazel were the leaders of the fallen angels. From this, we can see how Metatron, the lesser Yahweh, or the Word, became confused with his messenger Enoch, just as Metatron and the Memra, the incarnate Word, Hermes, had the epithet of Logios, the Word. Okay. Hermes being a corruption of Enoch. So then there's something called Hermetic Kabbalah. It's an amalgamation between Jewish Kabbalah and what's called Hermeticism. This amalgamation occurred when Hermeticists, who were followers of Hermes, noticed parallels between Hermeticism and Jewish Kabbalah and thus merged elements of the two systems together. Why did Hermeticism resemble Jewish Kabbalah? Hermeticism is a set of philosophical and religious beliefs based primarily upon writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the representation of the congruence of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. In fact, the Greek god Hermes was a reimagining of the Egyptian god Thoth. The Thoth worshippers of ancient Egypt had built their false religion around information inscribed on the Sethite pillar. That would shed light on the religion of Amenhotep IV. When he came to power, he had the old Egyptian religion abolished and replaced it with the worship of a single universal god called Aton. Aton had been recognized by the polytheistic religion, as the Egyptian polytheistic religion, as an aspect of Ra. Aton was the Aton had been recognized by the Egyptian polytheistic religion as an aspect of Ra. Aton was the disk of the sun, and it appears, or it bears mentioning, that Malachi chapter 4 verse 2 refers to Messiah as the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N. And remember, the Talmud calls the planet Mercury by the title the Scribe of the Sun in the Babylonian Talmud Shabbat 156a. After Amenhotep IV's death, the polytheistic religion returned, but did Amenhotep IV invent this monotheistic religion, or did he embrace a competing ancient Egyptian minority religion? Was this monotheistic religion, this monotheism, a monotheistic strain of the same perversion of Yahwism drawn from the Sethite pillar? Who knows? Clearly, the ancient Egyptian calendar was based on a perversion of the pre-flood, pre-fall calendar, which the ancient Egyptian priests learned from the Sethite pillar. They simply had to add 5 days to the end of the calendar to make it mostly accurate. Likewise, certain Jews attempting to correct the Enoch calendar to make it work might have added 4 days, one to each of the 4 seasons, to make a solar calendar that was also almost accurate, but not even quite as accurate as the Egyptian version. Maybe trying too hard for symmetry to replace 5 days with 4 and spread them into the 4 seasons. The the traditional Hebrew calendar continues to use the lunar months as required by the Torah. Okay. Numbers chapter 10 verse 10 says, "And in the day of your gladness, and in your appointed times, and in your new moons, you shall blow with the trumpets over your burnt offerings, and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings. And they shall be to you for a memorial before your Elohim. I am Yahweh your Elohim." And in Numbers 28:11, "And in your new moons you shall present a burnt offering unto Yahweh, 2 young bullocks, and 1 ram, 7 he-lambs, the first year without blemish." The word month in Hebrew is chodesh, and the word for new moon is Rosh Chodesh, literally the beginning of the month, or the beginning of the moon. And lest anyone should argue that Rosh Chodesh refers to a new month, but not necessarily a new moon. And some of those trying to force the Enoch solar calendar, the square peg to fit the round hole, have done just that. The book of the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, excuse me, in the Hebrew, which has been found at Qumran, we read in chapter 43, verses 6 through 8, "And even the shining moon wanes according to its time, though it is for ruling the seasons and an everlasting sign. By it are the seasons and the times of the statute, and shining it vanishes in its circuit. The new moon," and the Hebrew there is Rosh Chodesh, "according to its name, renews itself. How wonderful is it when it changes! The beacon of the host wanes on high, leaving the firmament aglow from its shining." So the traditional Hebrew calendar simply adds a leap month as needed to keep the lunar year from falling more than a month behind the solar year. But before the fall of the angels in Genesis 6, 1 Enoch 6, it was not necessarily to add a leap month, because the lunar year and solar year coincided exactly, just as their apparent sizes from Earth coincide exactly. Probably 360 days with 12 months of 30 days each. So there's a very good argument to be made, and I've just made it, that the calendar that is preserved and the astronomical movements that are preserved in the Book of Enoch are in fact preserving or presenting a pre-flood calendar, or not pre-flood, well, pre-flood, but even pre-fall of angels calendar, and that that prior to the fall of the angels, the motions were different, very possibly, very likely, with a 360-day year divided into 12 30-day months, possibly a 364-day calendar divided into 12 30-day months, with 1 month each season actually having 31 days. That's the Enoch calendar. At any rate, to take the calendrical information in the Book of Enoch as a ball and run with it, again, is problematic, despite the fact that so many people have done just that. So our last handout says 4 things to remember as we study the Astronomical Book, which we actually won't get to today, but we'll start in our next study in lesson 14. Excuse me. Number 1, The Astronomical Book was originally written in Hebrew, but survives only in Ethiopic. But the Ethiopic is rather different from the original Hebrew. Therefore, our surviving text is unreliable. But it's all we have to study. So you do what you can. Kind of like the parable of the talents. We can't study what we don't have. All we can study is what we do have. And what we do have is primarily the Ethiopic version. All right. Item 2. Second thing to remember. The Astronomical Book may not be presenting a solar calendar as an alternative to the traditional Jewish calendar at all. It may only be recording data concerning the tracking of astronomical bodies. Point number 3 to remember. The Astronomical Book may be presenting a record, not of how astronomical bodies move now, but how they are supposed to move, or how they were supposed to move, and how they moved before the fall of the angels recorded in Genesis 6 and 1 Enoch 6. And finally, point 4 to remember, the calendar in the Astronomical Book does not work. It presents a 364-day solar year that loses 1.25 days every year, among other problems. All right, so that's the end of lesson 13, and we'll pick up actually studying the calendrical section next week in lesson 14. Meanwhile, we need your support for this effort. Please make tithes and offerings if you possibly can to donations at wnae.org. You can send them by PayPal to the word